Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So nice to see you all again at this very early hour in the morning. We have many distinguished participants, ambassadors from Switzerland and India and many others. But I just want to congratulate with you Mr. An Ho-young, who will become our ambassador to United States soon, and he is with us this morning. As you know, Mr. An worked with me during the course of preparing G20 summit in Seoul. He was a Sherpa at the beginning, and then he was a G20 ambassador later, and then he became vice minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Well, Japan as a country is very important, not only to immediate neighbors like us, but the rest of the whole world. Japan is still number 3 economy in the world, and so whatever happens there affects the rest of the world, and in many critical ways. So we all are very much interested in what's happening in Japan. But today and recently, a lot of things are happening in Japan, particularly with political leadership change there. So this morning we are very, very fortunate to have 2 worldly renowned scholars in economics and political science who both of them are real authority on Japanese economy and Japanese politics. So they will tell us what's happening there and what it means to us, to Korea particularly. We have Professor Hugh Patrick. I'm sure you know him well if you haven't met him before. Actually, both of them were here some time ago, so you must have met him. If not, I'm sure you all know of him well. He still holds is the director of Center on Japanese Economy and Business, and he is Robert D. Calkins Professor of International Business Emeritus at Columbia University. Professor Patrick is one of the most distinguished and respected economists in the whole world. I had the privilege of knowing him for many years. Actually, he's a little bit senior to me, but we are good friends for many, many years. In fact, he is good friend of Korea, and he has many friends in this country. Of course, he's experts on Japanese economy and among other things. He still runs this Center on Japanese Economy and Business, and also he is the co-director of Columbia University's APEC Study Center. And before Professor Patrick joined Columbia University, he was at Yale, and he was director of that very well-known Yale Growth Center for many, many years. And he wrote so many books. He contributed so much to the field of macroeconomics and finance and government business, and in many areas. He wrote so many books and articles and contributed so much in the field of the economics. Was awarded with various honors and the recognitions from the Japanese government in particular. He was in November 1994, the government of Japan awarded him the Order of the Sacred Treasure, Gold and Silver Star, and so he contributes so much in studying Japanese economy and particularly in the field of finance. Well, I can go on, but with this, I will move to Professor Gerald Curtis, who is again very distinguished political scientist who is the authority on Japanese politics. He has written so many books on Japanese politics. He still is the Burgess Professor of Political Science at the Columbia University. And he also is a visiting professor at Waseda University and the Senior Research Fellow at the International Institute for Economic Studies in Tokyo, and also is a Tokyo Foundation. He wrote many books, The Logic of Japanese Politics, Japanese Way of Politics, and the Election Campaigning, Japanese Style, and many, many books on Japanese politics. He also was awarded various prizes, honors from the Japanese government, particularly in 2001, he was awarded with the Order of the Rising Sun and Gold and Silver Star by Emperor of Japan, one of the highest honors bestowed by the Japanese government. So Japanese government recognized his contribution. He also is a good friend of Korea. He comes to Korea frequently and have many friends here. So he knows both countries very well, so I'm sure he will tell us a lot what's happening there and what it means to Korea. With no further ado, I would like to invite Professor Hugh Patrick first.
It is a great pleasure to be here, and I love being flattered like that. My reason for being in Korea is I always want to try to understand better what's going on in the Korean economy and society. And I've come to Korea every year for many years, but I'm essentially an amateur. My amateur, meaning that I don't really know that much about Korea. Nonetheless, I've really been impressed by the 50 years plus of really impressive economic development and growth, and the peaceful transition from an authoritarian government to an active, vibrant democracy. I think those are probably the right words to use. And of course, I have many Korean friends, and as Dr. Sakhang said, I really like Korea. But at the same time, I understand Korea has a lot of problems, economic, social, political, in terms of your national security. So while I'm optimistic, I guess I'm a cautious optimist about Korea. But today I'm supposed to talk, and that's about something I know a little bit more, which is about the Japanese economy and the new vocabulary word, Abenomics, that is used to describe the three pillars or the three arrows of the Abe government's new approach to the Japanese economy and to economic policy. As you know, as Dr. Sakhang said, Japan is a major advanced, high-income, capitalist, industrial democracy, essentially based on markets and market factors. It is the third largest GDP in the world, and it is really based on high levels of technology and productivity and smart and hard-working people. And Japan is a clean, comfortable, safe country, except for occasional earthquakes, that sort of thing. I think the major barrier for Japanese companies and Japan in general is language. Japanese language sort of insulates Japan from the rest of the world, but at the same time makes it harder for Japanese to interact in the rest of the world as much as they should be. And I think this lack of command of English is one of the major vulnerabilities for Japanese companies. And another vulnerability is their weakness in being able to manage foreign managers. Foreign workers are okay, but foreign managers, I think, is an area that Japanese firms need to work to improve themselves. I don't know very much about Korean companies and Korean management, but I certainly know that on average, Koreans are significantly better at English than Japanese are. But that's not a big compliment, I must say. But the reality is, you look at the TOEFL scores and so forth, Korea does very well. As you know, Japan has gone through 2 decades of so-called two lost decades. And in a general sense, that's true. There's this persistent deflation and mediocre growth below its potential, weak labor markets, and a sort of a social sense of malaise or resignation. But I think this is too simple a macroeconomic statement of Japan's actual condition today. Over the last 2 decades, there have been a tremendous amount of change in institutions, in organizations, in corporate and personal behavior. And a lot of this change is below the radar screen. But it's obvious that Japan today is very different from Japan 20 years ago. The demographic realities of a declining labor force since 1995 or so, and now a declining population, have already had a big effect, and they will continue to. In some sense, Japanese demographic experience is a lesson for Korea and China in the future. Another aspect of sort of looking over this last 20 years of anemic performance is that the volatility of growth has been very high. You have recession, recovery, more growth, another recession, and so forth. And in particularly, Japan's involvement in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the global or high-income country recession. So Japan has gone through a difficult time. It was coming out of that recession, and then it slid back into mild recession last year, and now is recovering very rapidly, at least this year. So I have to look at my notes, and excuse me, it's because if I don't look at my notes, I'll forget what I'm supposed to say. But, you know, we could talk about Japan's difficulties, lost decade, and so forth. But if you think of it not in terms of total GDP growth, but because of a declining labor force, think of it in terms of GDP per capita or per worker or labor productivity. Japan has done quite well over the last 10 years. As well as the United States on the whole. So this sort of good performance is hidden by in a sense at the aggregate level by the demographic changes. That's not to say that labor is even though labor, the remarkable thing is you have deflation and low rates of unemployment at the same time, but basically, labor still continues to be misallocated and underutilized, and I think that's an ongoing major concern. As I said, Japan did grow, say, the 2002 to 2008 period at almost 2% a year, 1.8%, and their deflation weakened or improved, I guess is the word I want to use, from minus 1% to 0 or something. But then the Great Recession globally and in Japan, I think, set them back, and they're now still in the process, like the United States, still in the process of recovering. The rapid growth this year, or the next 12 months or so, will not be enough to end deflation and to achieve growth adequately over the longer run. And so that's why Prime Minister Abe's top priority of economic policy is so important. As you know, there are three components to this Abenomics. A dramatically expansive monetary policy, which was initiated last Thursday and anticipated by the appointment of Governor Kuroda and Deputy Governors Iwata and Nakaso, which took on effect on March 20. The second arrow is fiscal stimulus, which was embodied in a very large supplementary budget that was passed last month. And the third arrow, which is the most important and the most difficult, is structural reform. Let me say a little bit more about each of these. I knew the Bank of Japan was going to take some sort of expansive action, but like most observers, I really didn't expect it to be so extraordinarily strong as actually occurred last week. This new policy package is really quite dramatic. The doubling of the monetary base in the next 2 years by purchases of government bonds, the shifting to purchasing longer maturity bonds, so that instead of average holdings of 3 years, it'll be 7 years, meaning they'll buy all longer term bonds as well as short term. There's increase in the purchases of exchange traded funds, relatively modest so far, but taking on credit risk. And there has been I think a clear statement about that this policy duration will last until they say 2% rise in CPI is in effect. We have big hopes on how this will come out, but we really don't know. It's far too early. And Jerry Curtis and I argue about this. He's more of a skeptical guy than I am, I guess. So maybe after our presentations we can have some questions or discussion about that. The second arrow, but anyway, the monetary policy arrow is shot and is clear, and we have good expectations on that. The second arrow, fiscal policy, has a clear direction in the short term, that is stimulus, but in the long run, I think the strategy is not yet set. And this is in part because I think it's uncertain as to how quickly monetary policy will work and in ending deflation or that process. So it's not surprising that the fiscal arrow is being one part of it has been shot, or one arrow from that group has been shot, but others will I think have to be considered in the future. I feel strongly that the current fiscal stimulus is essential, and it's good that it has been provided, and it works together well with monetary policy to provide the sort of macro environment. However, there are three fiscal policy issues. First, when should the stimulus be ended and replaced with fiscal consolidation, which has to take place given the huge size of Japanese government debt. Fiscal consolidation should be done, but it should not be done prematurely. Deflation has to be brought to an end first, and the good growth path being established. So that's one problem. Second, should the currently enacted consumption taxes will be raised next year and the year after, and one of the issues is whether they should be allowed to go into effect as scheduled or be delayed. And I think that will depend on how the economy is performing during the course of the next 6 months and year. Third, once it's proper to the appropriate conditions are there for fiscal consolidation, it's going to mean a need to carry out a major tax reform and to raise taxes more. And what kind of taxes and structure I think will be important. That debate is only beginning in Japan, and of course that's something for Japanese, not Americans or foreigners to decide. So in terms of the first two arrows, or macroeconomic, monetary, and fiscal policy, Japan is on the right path. It's too early to see the results. Well, a big key to all of this will be expectations, both about ending deflation and about restoring full employment growth. Even before Abe was elected, Japanese expectations became quite positive because of the expectations of his being elected and of the sorts of policies that they thought that he would implement. So I see a really important positive mood shift. A couple of years ago, the feeling was one of resignation, of shoanai, nothing, it can't be helped. Now I have a sense of hope. I feel this sense of hope, and sometimes a little too extreme, even euphoria. So a key is going to be how to manage expectations in the future. That's something that's very difficult to do, and it will depend on more than hope. It has to have some results in order to be effective. The third arrow, structural reform, as I said, is the most necessary and the most important and the most difficult, and it will take the most time. I think that fiscal and monetary policy alone will not achieve stable long-run growth. So you've got to have greater structural reforms in order to create new opportunities for companies to invest in Japan. I think particularly in services, manufacturing is pretty efficient, but also in agriculture, which of course is a big political issue. So I think we have to wait and see what kind of structural reform programs and policies the government makes clear that it will implement. They've done two major things so far. One was a decision to enter the TPP negotiations, and I think that's an important step forward in structural reform. It will affect agriculture, it will affect other sectors, and in the nitty-gritty of the negotiations, we'll see how that comes out. I don't think TPP is enough. It's not going to solve everything. So we will just have to see how that process develops, because we realize sort of there are a lot of vested interests that are concerned about that. And in general, there's a problem in every society when you have interests that are based on the present system, including its restrictions and regulations. When you remove those regulations and restrictions and make things more open and more competitive, those interests are going to resist. And in Japan, it's agriculture, with a lot of talk about some of the doctors, the medical industry. And it's also a lot of Japanese government bureaucrats who want to protect their own turf, and who live by having and enforcing regulations. So how this is going to work out, I don't know. And that's a general problem. So TPP is one. A second one is a major structural reform now in the works is on energy, particularly electricity, and that's separation of the production or generation of electricity from its transmission, which is now currently done in a regionally monopolistic way. And the separation of production, transmission, the distribution of electricity will allow many opportunities for new companies to come in to produce electricity, to transmit it, to sell it in various ways. And so that, I think, will be an important competitive opportunity and development, which will lead to better energy policies. It, too, will face huge fights, and we don't know the details, and the devil is always in the details. And so the politics of how this goes about, I think, will be really interesting, but certainly it's not clear exactly how that will come out. I haven't seen a comprehensive set of proposal reforms yet, and we hope that the government announcement of its long-run strategic plan in late June will say more about that. But we know that one of the committees that is dealing with this is something called the Industrial Competitiveness Council, which has 10 people, mostly from the private sector, but also from public sector backgrounds. And as I understand it, there's a real division of opinion within this group. A minority, a strong minority, say that the best thing to do is to free up markets by engaging in reform and deregulation. The other group says the best thing to do is to provide more money to companies that are needed, especially small and medium enterprises, and help them take advantages of dormant technologies and so forth and so on. My view of that is that that's a way of keeping what we call zombie companies alive. And so I think that that's a wrong way to go. Certainly the Japanese are going that way. They're starting to throw more money, but I hope they will also engage in substantial reform that use the market forces more. So we'll have to see. I assume the Liberal Democratic Party will win the upper house election, and that Prime Minister Abe will be in office for 3, maybe 5 years, whatever. That's Jerry's area. But the only thing I see stopping that is if he makes some terrible mistake, which I think is very unlikely, or his health goes bad, and he seems to be very energetic and strong leader today, which is an impressive change, I think. So the economy will do well for the next 12 to 15 months, but after that, I'm much less certain. I worry about inadequate domestic demand. In a sense, household incomes need to go up, so consumption needs to go up. That means wages need to go up, but the mechanism is not there for that. I don't know how many reforms will actually be established and implemented. So we have a lot of questions to which we don't yet have the answers. I assume that the Abe government will somehow succeed in ending deflation, but I'm not sure how long and how well, and I think that can't be done on its own. It needs the support on the fiscal policy side. Personally, I think announcing a 2% target for the rise in the CPI, I don't know whether that was a right move psychologically or not. I'm less concerned whether they actually hit 2% than I am concerned that people will believe that deflation has ended and that they're on a right path. And so whether it's 1, 1.5, 2, if they get to that point, then I would worry less about the numbers. So, assuming that deflation is brought to an end, then the next big monetary policy challenge will be how to adjust interest rates upward smoothly without a major disruption in the Japanese government bond market. And so that's another long-run problem. My sense is that there's no conflict between fiscal stimulus now and fiscal contraction in the future. It's a matter of timing. In sum, I'm optimistic about Abenomics for the first year or two, but I still think it's quite uncertain what the results will be. Since I am an optimist by nature, I think Japan, at its worst, will at least muddle through. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be back in Korea. I haven't been here for a couple of years, I think maybe 3 years. So, and I always enjoy coming back and seeing the changes and talking to my friends and my former students. I have lots of students, that studied at Columbia in Korea, and I really like Korean students. I think Korean students are more loyal to their professor than students anywhere in the world. So, always makes me very happy when I'm here. Let me take just a few minutes and share some thoughts about the politics and foreign policy under this current Abe administration, and then we'll leave as much time as possible for questions. So as you know, Prime Minister Abe was Prime Minister 6 years ago for 1 year. It was a very unhappy experience. He came in with pretty high popular numbers. He was Prime Minister Koizumi's chosen successor, and then it went straight downhill for over the ensuing 12 months. He got ill with some bad stomach trouble, and finally had to resign. And I don't think anybody then would have anticipated that 6 years later, this is the fellow who would be back as prime minister. And he was in Washington in February, and he gave a speech at CSIS, and the title is "Japan is Back." Well, Japan's not quite back yet, but Mr. Abe, he's back. And Mr. Abe is back, and sometimes you wonder, or I wonder, is this Shinzo Abe really the same fellow who was prime minister 6 years ago? Because in many ways he's very different. Essentially, of course, he's the same person, but he's very different in his approach to politics. 6 years ago, he talked about Utsukushi Kuni, beautiful country, and a lot of abstract things, and kind of giving voice to his long-term aspirations about Japan with a different constitution and going back to some older values and so on. But this time, he learned a lesson from American politics. It's the economy, stupid. And that's what he's focused on. And so instead of this kind of abstract talk about things he can't do anything about in the short run, which was the story 6 years ago, this time it's all about what I'm going to do for you, the public, now. And he's been in office just a little bit more than 100 days, and it has been an extraordinarily successful 100 days. Even skeptics have to agree that it's very hard to fault Abe. He's a great branding of his strategy, so-called Abenomics, 3 arrows, easy to remember, fiscal consolidation, monetary, inflation targeting, and a structural reform. He's put everything else off to the side. Constitutional revision, which is a goal, which I think is very much a goal, but it's not a goal right now. It's not what he's talking about in great detail now. Very cautious on foreign policy, a point I'll come back to in a moment. So far, so good. And the consequence is that there is an optimism and a sense of hope among the Japanese public, and I must say among Wall Street investors as well, that hasn't been there for a very long time. So the stock market is up, the yen is down, and his popularity is soaring to new heights. Somewhere over 70% of the public supports Prime Minister Abe. Remember, when the LDP came back into office in the election in December, there was very little enthusiasm for the LDP. The voting rate was the lowest in the post-war period. There was very little support for Abe, little expectations he'd do well. It was basically, let's get rid of the Democratic Party, which has made such a mess of things over the past 3 years, that brought the LDP back in. He's done extremely well. So I think the concern now among a lot of people in Japan, outside of Japan, who follow Japan, is what happens after July. July is when there's going to be an election for the upper house of the Japanese Diet. All indications are that the LDP will score a major success. It probably can't win a majority of the seats on its own. Half the members are elected every 3 years for these 6-year terms. So even if it sweeps the election, it probably falls a little bit short of getting a majority of seats. It's, it doesn't have a majority now. It falls short, but with its coalition partner, the Komeito, they'll clearly have a majority. The Democratic Party, which has been in power for the past 3 years, may well, I won't say it's going to disappear, but I think it'll be wiped out in this election. We'll probably split. I think its future is past It was brief. It's over. An issue I don't have time to go into here this morning, but how the opposition restructures itself is a big issue facing Japanese political democracy, really. But he's going to do very well in the upper house election. So then the question is, when he does, and Abe seems to be in good health. He's very vigorous, running around the country and running around the world. He was in Mongolia last week for 2 days, and he's already been in Southeast Asia, he's been in the U.S., been in Mongolia. He's going to Russia next month. So forth and so on. Probably be here. In any case, assuming he stays healthy and, as Hugh said, doesn't make any big mistakes, his goal is win this upper house election, win the upper house election 3 years from now, win the lower house election that'll probably take place at the same time, and then move on to deal with some of the other big issues he's interested in. So I think the worry is that when he wins this upper house election, he's going to shift his focus. He's done he shot his 2 arrows, and the third arrow will, is next in line, but he might focus more on kind of a nationalist agenda, constitutional revision, getting tough, being tougher with the Chinese, whatever. I don't think so. I think he's going to continue being the kind of person we've seen over the past 3 months. Why? He wants to stay in office. He wants to go down as in history as a successful prime minister the second time around. The only way to do that is to keep his eye on the ball, keep his eye on the economy, and on keeping the momentum, keeping the enthusiasm for economic revival high. You can't, this so-called third arrow, structural reform, you can't shoot it one day and expect results the next. But he has to have a constant menu of actions and policies that convinces the markets and convinces the public that Japan is really on the right track. If he drops the economic ball and turns his attention to constitutional reform, or to a more nationalist agenda, more generally, patriotic education, or so forth and so on. First of all, it'll divide the public. The public is united right now behind Abe's economic policy. It'll divide the public. It'll scare the neighbors. It will result in criticism from within his own party about his shift. I don't believe it's going to happen. I think he has to stay focused on the economy. So that leads to the question about Japanese foreign policy. Abe has a reputation, I think, and it's very strong here in South Korea. You hear a lot about Abe as an extreme rightist. And in Japan as well. I mean, his image, well deserved, is that he's on the more conservative wing of the LDP. And he is. But he's a cautious hawk. That's my way of describing him and his colleagues. He's a cautious hawk. Yes, he's more hawkish. He would like to see lots of changes. He'd like to see a more muscular, robust Japanese defense policy. But he's a realist. This is a tradition among Japanese conservative politicians. Their heart may be more ideologically, more sort of on the ideological right, but their brain is, let's look carefully at the world situation and decide what is the best response we can make to survive, to sustain Japan's peace and prosperity. So far, he's been very cautious. Yes, he's increased the defense budget. First time after 11 years of a declining defense budget, he's increased it. But I think it's a 1% increase. It's not much. There are other things going on in the defense area, shifting, as you would expect, shifting the priorities from to dealing with Chinese naval expansion in the East China Sea and so on. But don't look for a major expansion of Japanese defense spending I don't think it's in the cards. People have thought of Abe as being kind of an autonomous defense guy, more autonomous Japan. But I think he's done and I think there was concern in the U.S. that that concern they couldn't quite, that he might be too far on the right and so forth. But his visit to Washington was very successful in February. He oversold it, and the Japanese press bought his line that he went to Washington and he restored an alliance that was in crisis. He didn't restore an alliance in crisis. There was no crisis to restore. The alliance is very strong. The U.S.-Japan alliance, the roots are so deep, and the relationship is so extensive that even someone like Prime Minister Hatoyama, who created lots of troubles, couldn't really upset the alliance. And Prime Minister Noda, the last DPJ Prime Minister, was quite popular in Washington. From everything I hear, Obama liked him a lot. There was no crisis. And so Abe oversold it, but I don't blame him for trying to make the most out of the trip. But it was a good trip, and he did three things in his visit to Washington that I think were particularly important and impressive for Americans and reassuring to the Obama administration. One was he committed to the TPP, and everybody had expected that he would do that after the upper house election. But Abe's view, and I think this is really important, was that if he waited until after the upper house election and then announced that Japan was going to join the TPP negotiations, the public would rightfully view him as a liar. Campaigns for the election, not making a commitment to join TPP, and no sooner is the election over, then he says, okay, now it's safe. So he made the decision very early on, from what I now know, very early on, that they would announce TPP before the upper house election. And he also had a good political sense. Japan has changed over these past 20 years. The average age of Japanese farmers is over 65. They're an ever-dwindling labor force. Their lobbying organization, so-called JA, the Nokia organization, represents more the people who work in JA than it does the farmers who actually till the land. So he, I think, sensed, and he was right, that the public would support TPP, and the majority of the Japanese public does support the entrance into TPP. But the fact that he made the commitment in Washington to join the TPP negotiations, I think caught Obama by surprise. I don't think they were prepared. I don't think they basically expected Abe would come to say hello and go home, like it often happens. But he actually came with some substantive things to say. That was, I think, a very important move. And they will get into the TPP negotiations. They will be accepted into TPP negotiations, probably in July. He's already made commitment on, that they're not going to make a big deal out of automobile, the tariffs on Japanese automobiles, making some concessions to the U.S. There are a couple of really interesting issues apparently now still being debated, but we can talk about it later. The other thing he did was he made a commitment to move forward with the relocation of this marine base at Tenma in Okinawa to a place called Henoko in the northeast. This issue, it isn't only that the DPJ screwed up this issue, but this has been out there since Prime Minister Hashimoto was Prime Minister in the mid-1990s. There was a commitment to move this space. The LDP never was able to move forward with it. Now, Abe has made the decision to force something that no government had done before, to force the government in Okinawa, the governor of Okinawa, to say yes or no. The governor of Okinawa has to agree to allow an environmental assessment to be made or not. If he doesn't, it can't go forward. If he does, then that's the next step. So I think now the screws have been put on the Okinawa government. Abe will whether this will come off or not, it's not clear. It looks more and more there's a chance that this relocation agreement will actually be able to be realized. But if not, at least I think the U.S. will recognize that Abe has gone the extra mile to try to make it happen. And if it doesn't happen, then you go back to the drawing boards. But at least we move this issue move it to the side. The third thing that he did, which was very important, was he didn't say anything provocative about China, which I think was a big concern in Washington. That Abe is kind of, he's anti-Chinese. He's being tough with China, and he is on Senkaku Island issue, as I'll come back to in a minute. In Washington and in his speech at CSIS, he said nothing to annoy the Chinese, to make the Chinese mad. He avoided the issue. Obama said nothing about China in the conversation with Abe in the public comments. The U.S. wants to try to find a way to coexist with China in this part of the world, and we sure don't want the Japanese to be throwing monkey wrench into the U.S.-China relationship, or to raise tensions and get us caught up in some sort of a conflict over some uninhabited islands in the East China Sea called the Senkaku Islands. So he left Washington, I think, with people feeling quite relieved. That Abe was committed to the alliance, he's cautious about China, and so forth, and so on. The one issue on foreign policy that they talked a lot about, and that was the only thing that really got into the public statements, was North Korea and taking a very tough agreement, taking a tough line with North Korea, because that was kind of an easy thing to do. The fact that none of this is likely to work in changing North Korean behavior is a separate issue, and we can come back to that. On China relations, Abe's, this government's view is the Senkaku Islands belong to Japan. There's no dispute to talk about, but we're happy to talk about other things and want to have a strategic, reciprocal relationship with China. I personally think this is unrealistic. There is a dispute, whether you like it or not. There is a dispute. There always has been a dispute over the Senkakus, and Deng Xiaoping had the right answer to dealing with this dispute in the late 1970s, when he said, "This is too tough an issue for our generation to handle. Let's leave it for future generations to deal with." And so this, put it on the shelf. And it's been taken off the shelf most recently because of the irresponsible actions of the then governor of Tokyo, Ishihara Shintaro, who decided to buy, 4 of those islands are owned privately, and to buy 3 of them from its owner, and then, the story, Prime Minister Noda bought them instead to prevent that from happening and to maintain the status quo, and got that message, try to send that message to the Chinese. This was all to maintain the status quo, prevent any building on the island, anybody from living on the island, which is what Ishihara would have done. But the Chinese didn't buy it, and instead, had demonstrations and riots and burned down Japanese factories and killed some poor Chinese who was driving a Japanese car, and an outrageous reaction. So that's the state. So I think there's a dispute, and probably the Japanese would be best off recognize there's a dispute, publicly call for submitting it to the International Court of Justice, which the Chinese will reject, but at least it would get the Japanese on the side of advocating resolution through the rule of, through international law, and talk about the issue. Only, talk about it this year, next year, for the next 10 years, talk about it, and for as long as necessary, but don't do anything about it. On Korea relations, on South Korea relations, obviously the two troublesome issues in South Korea-Japan relations are Dokdo and so-called comfort women. And I think on Dokdo, this Japanese government's view on Dokdo is that why in the world do the Koreans want to keep on raising this issue of Takeshima? You have the islands. The Japanese are not going to try to take these islands. There's any thought that the Japanese would use some kind of send military ships to in the waters around Dokdo or escalate this issue. There is no basis to this. So I think the view among the Japanese leadership is, if the South Koreans would simply be quiet, this issue would go away. Someone very senior in this government, in the Japanese government, said to me just the night before I got to Tokyo, he said, most Japanese didn't even know there was an issue about Takeshima. There's a big difference between Japanese and Koreans. Every Korean knows about Dokdo. Very few Japanese knew about Takeshima until the Koreans made a big issue out of Dokdo. So his view was, if the Koreans are making us, if the Koreans make this a public issue, then we will respond by saying, no, they belong to us, and put that in our textbooks. So this year, for the first time, Takeshima is in the textbooks. So if the Koreans would simply back off and not say anything, and President not visit the island and do things to kind of change raise the temperature, this issue is not a big issue. There's no Japanese intention of doing anything to challenge the status quo, which is that those islands are run by the South Koreans. I find that actually a very convincing and reassuring view on the part of Japan. They're not going to make an issue out of Takeshima unless you make them make an issue out of Takeshima, Dokdo. That's my sense. And on the comfort women issue, that is a very, very dangerous issue for Japan, not only in relations with South Korea, for obvious reasons, but in the United States, because the reaction about Japanese government statements that seem to somehow try to explain away or defend the treatment of the atrocious treatment of these women during the war just raises a huge emotional reaction among Americans. And so, when Japanese right-wing politicians go to New York, New Jersey, where there was some memorial set up for in a community there about these so-called comfort women, when they go and protest, it only makes people even angrier about what happened. So I think Abe understands that. And whatever his personal views are about this, what happened, he's being very careful, very cautious. Well, I better stop talking. He's being very cautious about not provoking anger, especially here. So I guess, so I think on South Korean relations, they're not going to do things, I don't believe, that will make this Dokdo issue more intense. They're trying to be quiet on the comfort women issue. I think he's really looking forward to improving relations under the new PAC government here. And finally, one more territorial issue, and I think this is quite interesting. The Northern Islands issue with Russia. Territorial issues are generally almost, these issues that Japan faces are impossible of resolution. You can't really resolve Dokdo, you just live with it, as far, for Japan. And you can't really resolve the Senkaku Islands issue. You basically try to put it back on the shelf. But you can resolve the Northern Islands issue. And I think one of the interesting things to look at over the next several months is whether there is movement towards a resolution of the Northern Islands. There's a good incentive for both sides. Russia wants Japanese investment, especially in the energy sector, and Japan is not getting its nuclear power plants back online anytime soon. It needs more energy. So there's an incentive, and there are 4 islands. The Russians they agreed in 1955 to return 2 of them. So this is now a question of 2 plus alpha. 2 plus what? The Japanese want all 4 back. They're not going to get them. They know that. So the question is whether they can figure out what that alpha is. Do you have joint management of the other 2 islands, or you add up the total land area and divide it in half? There are lots of formula out there, but they are thinking about ways to resolve this issue. That would be a huge victory for Abe, foreign policy victory, if he could come up with a solution, Northern Islands, and it's like Nixon goes to China. If anybody could do it in Japan, it's someone who has the confidence of the right, who can't really be attacked by the right. Finally, constitutional revision. This is going to be the next big issue on the Japanese agenda. There's a lot of support for it in the LDP, and Abe is being very clever. Instead of going straight to Article 9 or other articles of the Constitution that he wants to see changed, his immediate objective is to change Article 96. Article 96 is the article that determines how you change the Constitution. Right now it's a 2/3 vote in both houses, then a public referendum. He wants to change that 2/3 vote to a simple majority. That would make it easy to get constitutional revision issues through the Diet and then bring them to the public. I think it's very dangerous. You know, every country, or virtually every country that I'm aware of, makes the hurdle for constitutional revision quite high. It's very high in the U.S. You know, 2/3 of both houses of the Congress, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to agree. Most countries have high hurdles, though I'm not sure what it is here in South Korea. But this might go through. In any case, that'll be on the agenda further down the road. So, you know, I think over the next several months, it's pretty predictable that he will focus on the economy. He will continue to be cautious on foreign policy. He'll look to improve relations with South Korea. He'll look to avoid escalating tensions with China. Might try to improve relations with Russia. But the long-term goal is constitutional revision, what he calls post-war, freeing Japan from the post-war regime, whatever in the world that means. This is a prime minister calling for regime change in his own country. It's kind of strange. But I don't think, I think the real question for the next period, for the next year, is Abenomics really going to work? If not, he's not going to be around very long. But that's not just bad news for Mr. Abe. That would be really disastrous news for Japan. If Abenomics doesn't work, you know, this is his so-called Hail Mary pass. He's thrown the ball out there, and if they fumble it and it doesn't work, it's a really bad situation. But will it work? You heard Hugh. We're on somewhat different sides of that issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for both of you for very insightful and illuminating presentations. Now, with this, I would like to invite some comments or questions from the floor. First, Ambassador from India, please. And then Dr. Kim and Dr. Ansari. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to join the chair in complimenting you both for an excellent presentations. My first question to Professor Patrick, I think I would agree with what you say about the positive mood shift in Japan, and you are spot on that a positive sentiment is half the battle won. So certainly they are on the right track. Question is that do you see any tripping points in this journey, and both domestic and particularly external? And if so, would you like to touch upon that? You mentioned energy as one of the important structural reforms, and do you think that the nuclear energy on which there is an ongoing debate is an essential component, because this is one aspect which is important for Japan, for Korea, for India, and many of our countries. So would that be the case? And Professor Curtis, just one very quick question. Change of Article 96. Does it entail need a 2/3 majority to change it, or does it need a simple majority? Thank you.
Okay. Now, Dr. Kim and...
First question is Abenomics. The three errors, of course, are defined as economic textbooks and basic theory as a stimulant. One catch, however, as John Maynard Keynes said, it's easy to pull string, but it's very difficult to push wet noodles. Now, even if all those stimulus comes in, it is up to the real economy to respond to it and spend money. 2% target they set is as the benchmarking of the Abenomics. How realistic do you think it is to make 2%, particularly as Jerry said? You have to succeed in Abenomics to have the continuing form of the party. My question to Jerry is that the concern around Japan is that Japan's constitutional reform, which they will not achieve this time because they're not going to get the upper house single majority, and the Comey told me they are partner, but they will not be supporting the constitutional reform. However, if in the second election, the next one around, if LDP gets the simple majority, how likely do you think it is that they will push for it and to change that the peace constitution to achieve what they want, so-called the normal state? Thank you.
Okay, Dr. An, please.
Hugh, it's really nice to meet you again here in Korea. I have two questions on the Hugh's presentation. First, Japanese, the quantitative easing is indeed perhaps the boldest ever. But this morning I noted that the IMF managing director Lagarde lauded the Japanese action. You also provide a very positive assessment. My question is that, is there any sense of the Japanese policy by drawing a depreciation of Japanese yen and exporting the product in a competitive price, taking the competitive advantage, and this line of the policy is following sort of the thy neighbor, beggar policy. Is there any sentiment among, the Japanese, the scholars, but international community, for example, from Japanese scholars, and in fact, Koreans are very much concerned about this, boldest ever quantitative easing policy may drive a Japan's, thy neighbor, beggar policy issue. And then second question, you mentioned the TPP. This is, in fact, the bilateral, showdown between Japan and the United States. Korea, we negotiated the FTA with Japan about, I think, a decade ago, but we suspended, very abruptly, given the Japanese very low level of the concession on agriculture sector and, service sector, etc. So if United States failed to persuade Japan to open up agriculture sector, substantially, perhaps as US did for, Korea's FTA, and if United States fails to open up Japanese service sectors or government procure market, I think the quality of the TPP is very much lower than the Korea's FTA, and so I don't know, how much you can get out of this such a disclosed Japanese market, even though you succeed in TPP, except some political rhetoric. Okay, so in this regard, I think the Korea is much urged by the U.S. to join the TPP process, and so once we see that the Japan really opens up, and the Korea perhaps could jump in. So I would like to see your view on to what extent Japan is ready, to open up the agriculture sector and the service government procure market. And Professor, I think the Koreans really would like to establish a good neighbor relationship with the, Japan. But on the territorial, Dokdo issues, okay, as you said, Korea could keep silent. I've told you, we occupy the island. But the thing is that Japanese government keep raising the bar on Dokdo every year, step by step. For example, Japanese all the textbooks, now I think it's mandatory to put everything, every textbook, and it's required teachers to, teach their students, okay, that Takashima, in their word, is their territory. And furthermore, Japanese central government is going to upgrade the Shimaneki Prefecture the activity as a national, the Takashima Day or something like that. So if Japan keeps doing this, raising the bar, and the Koreans, cannot back up, and we should protest, and we should claim, our own the sovereign right over there. And Japan now is intend to bring that issue to the international court. So Koreans should keep silent on this, ongoing this doctor issue. Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's enough for the first round. Yes, okay.
Yeah, probably each of us will want to talk for 40 minutes. Let me just give very quick answers to our Indian ambassador colleague. What would be tipping points, and we can discuss that. I think if the Abenomics policies do not succeed, then, as Jerry said, that will be disastrous, I think, not just for Abe, but for Japan. And so that's why I think somehow they will not allow it to fail. In terms of international relations, as one Japanese said to me recently, things could get messed up if Prime Minister decided to visit Yasukuni Shrine. Right? Nuclear energy clearly is a very important issue. There are two sets of issues. One is how quickly and how many of the plants that are closed down will be reopened. And I think there's a pressure or an incentive from the government now to try to move ahead quickly on that. But the reality is there's a real anxiety about safety, and so it will take a long time to approve, and probably a year or so before the 7 or 8 will be reopened. How many will ultimately be reopened is quite unclear. That's one issue. The long run issue is whether they will continue to produce, build new nuclear stations to replace the existing ones. This is a deep sort of political issue. Economists would probably say it's rational to build additional nuclear facilities and rely on nuclear power, and indeed that's what implicitly the government seems to be saying. But the politics of achieving this are going to be very difficult because there has been such an emotional reaction on it. So I'm going to pass that question to Jerry if he gets around to it. Dr. Kim is exactly right that the real question is to what extent will these macro policies, particularly monetary policies, actually have an effect to encourage increased expenditures in the real economy. And this is where Jerry and I argue quite a bit. I can make some arguments that even though interest rates are low, there will be some effect on business investments. Jerry says no, people just take their money and go abroad with it. But I think we would agree that the important thing is that this is a package of 3 arrows, and too much expectations on the monetary policy side, I think, will be misguided. It's gotten a lot of press coverage, and I think when you get a lot of press coverage, it quite often exaggerates. One way or the other. So, for me, the fiscal policy and particularly these structural reforms are the real key. It's the structural reforms that will open up new markets domestically, that will provide opportunities leading to investments and the performance in the real economy. So I think that's the way Japan has to go on that. And I guess in a sense it's true that this monetary expansion, as Dr. Ahn said, my view is that the main purpose of this monetary policy is to stop deflation in Japan. And the deflation has persisted for far too long. Very mild, but very persistent and very pernicious. And what we've learned over the last 40 years is we now know how to stop inflation. But we haven't learned, because we haven't had other cases, how to stop deflation. And so this is, I think, a really important test case, and so it will be really important. Anytime you pursue an expansionary monetary policy and you have flexible exchange rates, your exchange rate is going to weaken. And so I think that that is a natural byproduct of the monetary policy. I don't think it's the basic purpose, but it's very, in a sense, it's helpful because it will make exports more competitive and more attractive, and that's to the disadvantage of Japan's competitors, particularly Korea. But that's the nature of life, you know. You adjust in competitive markets. One of the things that's always impressed me is how effective this country adjusts to major swings in exchange rates. And so, from my point of view, in terms of Korea, I think there's too much anxiety about exports and not enough anxiety about increasing domestic consumption. And this is an economy with a rising inequality of income distribution. That's an issue that has to be addressed. How to improve consumption at home. You have the advantage of having strong fiscal weapons that have not been used. So I think, in a sense, a mindset change has to occur in Korea, which shifts from believing that the only way to save Korea is through exporting. The only way to save Korea is through improving your domestic performance. So that's sort of a carry-on about the exchange rate issue. On TPP, I am more optimistic that the United States will really push Japan quite hard on agriculture. Rice will probably be protected, but maybe a couple of other crops, but there'll be others that will be opened up more, and so that's going to be where the negotiations will be, and I think Japan will push on services and on other areas in the United States. So I think, in a sense, having TPP is for Japan a form of foreign pressure that they know how to use and utilize for domestic purposes. I think Japanese policymakers really need to reform agriculture, and they know that, and they want to figure out how to do it. And it's not going to be immediate. It's going to be sort of 10-year tie-in period. This is my guess. You know, it take 10 years of adjustment to carry through. Well, in 10 years, a lot of Japanese, I said it impolitely the other day, I said a lot of Japanese farmers are going to be dead. They're going to be retired, okay? Average age is 65, 66. More than a quarter of them are 70 or more. And there's always a decline. That decline will continue. And so if you have a scheduling, gradual adjustment, it will ease the political and economic burden of this adjustment. So I think from the viewpoint of the Japanese government, they understand that agriculture has to be reformed, and it's nice to blame it on the Americans. So I'm more positive on it, in terms of the results. I think what's important, on the other hand, is that Japan come in arguing that we have to have rules and principles. And the United States says this, but we also want to protect our trucks with a 25% tariff and this and that and the other thing. We probably won't, the tariff on trucks will stay because, automobiles for the United States are our cultural symbol. And I think we have a stupid tariff on trucks, but anyway, those kinds of issues are going to be on the table, but I think there's a real commitment by the United States and by the other 10 countries, several of them, particularly Australia, to push hard and make this a really a very strong agreement, because they want to define what the rules of the game should be, not just for these 11 members, but essentially globally. And since Doha has failed, this is sort of the push forward. That's the way I read it. Sorry, I took too long.
So Article 96, yes, you do need 2/3 vote to amend it. Not impossible, first of all, it seems to be more support for possibly amending Article 96 than amending any of the other, like Article 9 and so on. So this issue hasn't really yet entered into the public debate very much. I don't think people realize what the implication, a lot of people don't realize the implications. But so I don't think it's going to happen very quickly, but the issue is going to be very much out there in the public debate. Abe will push it. People will discuss it. A lot of foreign countries will start worrying, Koreans will worry about it. The opposition to it is not very strong. A lot of people in the DPJ support the idea. There's the so-called Restoration Party, by the mayor of run by the mayor of Osaka. They're out to the right of the LDP on these issues of constitutional reform. This issue is coming down the pike. And this raises a really interesting question. Well, I just raise it and I won't try to deal with it here. But so, people worry, that this is Japan. You're going to, amend Article 9, remove the constraints on the Japanese military, become a so-called normal country. So Abe did an interview with a Korean magazine. In Japanese, it's called Gekkan Chosen. I don't know, so monthly Korea or something, in which they said, you're thought of being extreme rightist and you want to change the constitution. And his response was, look, what I want to do is, having the right of collective security and calling the Japanese military a military. He said, well, in Korea, you have the right of collective security. You call your military a military. So, if I'm a rightist, then every country in the world is rightist. What's so wrong with Japan wanting to just be a normal country? So the answer to that is really very important. And I think this question is being raised by a lot more Japanese now than ever before. So why not? Why should Japan have one hand sort of tied behind its back and not like other countries be able to have a collective defense, you have to have a military, for God's sakes, call it a military. Why not? And I think there are good reasons why not. But they're not really being debated very much. And I think that, the big difference between Japan and Germany is not that one apologized for the behavior and the other did not. The big difference is Germany really got embedded in a security structure in Europe that made people confident that the Germans were not going to go off on their own. That's what NATO was all about. The first Secretary General said the purpose of NATO, keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. But in East Asia, there's no comparable organization. So the two things that made people somewhat reassured about Japan was the U.S.-Japan alliance and the Japanese Constitution. Those are the constraints. So now with the U.S. after Lehman shock, feeling a lot more fiscal constraint, wanting its allies to do more, wanting Japan to do more, that coming on top of possibly removing constraints, constitutional constraints, rightfully makes people wonder. This would be like there'd be no NATO and no EU or Europe and Germany saying we're going to become a normal country. That would be very disturbing to neighboring countries. This is the issue, and that's why I think the issue is how do you improve South Korean Japan relations? How do you build some kind of a security community in East Asia? Too much talk about building up military, not enough talk about how to build these networks that could lead to to real trust. That's the issue. But so be it. On nuclear, I think politically, you may get a couple of nuclear plants back online next year or two, but very little. I can't imagine, I don't think there's much chance of new nuclear power plants being built in Japan. I think the ones that, the ones in existence will be going off, will be shut down over the next decade or two. Abe wants believes they have to have more rely on nuclear. But after what happened in Fukushima, this is very, very tough. That's why I said imports, and they're really excited about shale gas from the U.S. and the potential of importing oil from the U.S. and Russia and elsewhere. And on TPP, finally, I don't think the U.S. push is so much on agriculture. Of course, we'll push them on agriculture, but we want to protect sugar and other agricultural products. The Japanese will find a way to protect their sugar, which is Okinawa, and rice. But I think there will be a shift away from tariffs to some kind of an income support policy for farmers. The real push from the United States on Japan is not so much on agriculture. That will be negotiation, but the push which they're trying to get the Japanese to make some concessions on before agreeing to have them enter the negotiations is get an agreement in advance on autos, that is protecting the American automobile industry, getting some agreement on there's an issue about the Japanese postal system, post office, the bank, and particularly insurance side, making it more of a level playing field. And there's a lot of pressure on Japan on this, and things relating to medical equipment. So the U.S. is playing a very tough game of trying to extract concessions from Japan as a condition for getting into the negotiations. And my sense, and Hugh and I think have a similar view, you know, the idea that this is going to be wrapped up sometime in November or something, I don't think there's any chance in the world that the TPP is going to be concluded anytime soon. We've seen with all these multilateral negotiations how politically contentious they become and how long they take. So I think that this TPP issue is going to be stretched out, which means that for Abenomics, how important is TPP in actually forcing early major decisions about structural reform in Japan? It's going to be a long process. Can the Japanese maintain this enthusiasm that Abenomics is going to work? I wonder. And, you know, as Hugh mentioned, now Japan needs fiscal stimulus. Then when it's kind of on a roll, you turn to fiscal consolidation. Well, that's always pushed down the road. That's how they got up to over 200% of, debt to GDP ratio. My guess is the Ministry of Finance has been very supportive. It was supportive of this 10 trillion yen supplemental budget. It was very happy with Kuroda getting in to the bank. But after the consumption tax increase is finally approved, the cabinet has to make a final decision this fall. Once the cabinet says we're going forward with it, then the Ministry of Finance pressure on the government on fiscal consolidation will be very, very powerful. And I think we'll see the result being you can't do a lot more stimulus. You don't really do consolidation. The debt goes up, and if they don't get growth, they got a major problem. So that's why you have to hope that the changed expectations will lead people, consumers to spend more and companies to invest more, and it'll become a virtuous cycle. But this is a very risky strategy. Okay, sorry. Just one thing on Dokdo. Yeah. My personal, if you want I'll try to give you my best assessment of what the Japanese are up to. My personal view is Japan should say, it's Korean territory. We're not going to argue about it. We're sure not going to have a national Takashima Day and, send government officials to Shimane, for their Takashima Day. No, I think that, that this issue, it's much more in Japan's interest, to have a good relationship with South Korea and to let to give up on this Takashima issue. But it's not going to happen. So realistically, it's simply not, the Japanese are not going to say, yes, okay, you've convinced us. Takashima, Dokdo is Korean, we accept that. That's not going to happen. So how do you put this issue on the shelf and not have it poison the relationship? Because it just turns Japan-Korea relations in some ways is so good, and at the popular level, Korea is such a popular country in, Korean culture and pop music and all that stuff is so popular in Japan. And, you come here and I walk around this hotel and I think, wait a minute, in Korea, Japan, I'm hearing so much Japanese because you still have, even though the numbers have decreased, you still have lots of Japanese tourists. Why let this issue of Dokdo Takashima spoil this poison this relationship? Both sides have an obligation to try to put it on the shelf. So the president visiting the island and poking his finger in the eyes of the Japanese, I don't understand. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't serve the national national interest, might serve some domestic political interest, sure doesn't serve the national interest. So I would, hope, as an outside observer, that both sides could figure out how to say, let's see if we can get through a year without anybody saying the word Dokdo or Takashima.
You want to say more on it?
Well, I just worried what Jerry was going to say, and then he said the last part, which was, these are intractable issues, territorial issues, and the best thing is to try to figure out how to postpone them. The United States has an intractable issue with Canada on some part of island that is sticking down, and we say the bottom half is ours. And it's not a big national issue, but it's a big local issue. But it's sort of agreed we will let it just be as an issue. And so I don't see easy solutions. And it's amazing how nationalistic every country feels about unimportant territory.
Yes, yes. Dr. Chung is the last, comment from the floor. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your insightful thoughts on the Japan's Abenomics and Foreign Policy. My question is regarding the success of Abenomics, and do you think the Abenomics can be successful without support from the U.S.? When Abenomics came out in the form of the quantitative easing, there's some criticism, by other countries, as Professor Patrick mentioned that there's the effect on the exchange rate is a byproduct. But because of that, the externality on the other countries, criticism came out. And then they went away when the U.S. actually came out and support Abenomics. So I'd like to hear your take on that part, as well as the significance of Japan's entry into the TPP negotiations in APEC. The perspective of APEC. Thank you.
Okay.
In every country, in democracies, you'll always find somebody who criticizes anything, and sometimes you think their arguments are very valid. Sometimes they are reflecting very narrow interests, and of course, countries worry about their exchange rates, but we have mechanisms. That's why we have the global system of exchange rate adjustment as we do, and we live with that. I thought that the head of the IMF, Lagarde, saying that she's very supportive of what Japan is doing was a very important international signal, and the correct signal. So in that respect, I think it'll generally the atmosphere will be positive, and of course there will have to be adjustments. I'm not sure I answered fully, but Jerry, you might want to say something.
Okay. With this, we have to close the session, and both professors have other engagement. As I was saying at the very beginning, Japan is, as a country, very, very important. Not only to Korea, but to the rest of the whole world. In that regard, particularly from the perspective of Korea, Japan still is very important trading partner and investment partner. So we would like to see Abenomics succeed. I personally like to see Abenomics to really succeed. If you look at from the real economic side, we have our vested interest in the Abenomics success there. But I think the Prime Minister made a mistake at the very beginning. He said the purpose of the quantitative easing is exchange rate. He said it. That's a very, very not very wise the statement. And the U.S. quantitative easing too. This exchange rate is a byproduct, as Professor Patrick said. But he said this is the purpose. And he politicized this, which is a very unwise move on his part. And that is the thing which made this whole issue the really politicized, and the people see in that context. And I hope, actually, Groda is a good friend of mine for many years. I hope, again, he be very apprehensive about this, I think, and we should be very careful. And again, TPP again, you know, from the very beginning, people outside the United States see TPP really in geopolitical terms, not in economic terms, and the particular attention to China. And the people see that why Abe wanted to join the TPP and why Japanese people support it. It's more geopolitically motivated than economically motivated. So once you get into the negotiations, as both of you said rightly, I think it'll be a rather protracted process. And I think this will have more geopolitical discussions in this region in particular. Now, success of Abenomics, in my view, is third era. What the Prime Minister Abe is. I'm really wondering if he has real political determination or will to carry out these structural adjustments. And I think that's where the real the issue is now. I think people just concentrate on this monetary easing and fiscal stimulus, but the third arrow is important. And if he has will, then he obviously would like to get the Kayatsu and foreign pressure and take advantage. But I really don't know. He was the one who opposed postal sector reform, right? When so I really want to see what he can do about it. Then I think that is the issue. And then Japanese economy may do well in a couple of years. Otherwise, I think they will, by 2015, the debt-to-GDP ratio may go up to 250%. And when interest rate goes up, and then Japan made into a problem, run into a problem fiscally. So with structural adjustment, particularly in the service sector, and I think Japan will do very well. We would like to see Japan succeed in that regard. But I hope he again does not. Politicians should take advantage of the national emotions for their own advantage, whether it's a Tokyo or Abenomics. And this region needs closer cooperation and policy coordination. Well, with this we have to end, and it was a very, very stimulating session, and I hope we'll bring two leading scholars back in the near future. And since they are there, they know this region so well, I hope you tell Japanese policymakers and the Prime Minister Abe and send good messages from Korea. And,
Thank you.
okay, thank you. Thank you.